Hi everyone, this video is about the moral argument and why I think it's one of the best arguments in favour of God's existence. I would consider it to be one of the top 3 arguments in that respect. Now, William Lane Craig's ministry has done an amazing video summary of this argument, and I would recommend everybody check that video out. I'll link that in the description below. In order to talk about this argument, I'll have to summarise it first, so here's my best attempt to do so. I like to start by talking about the fact that many people claim that a loving, omnipotent God must not exist since there's so much suffering in the world. However, this leads us to consider the question, why is suffering evil? On what basis can you say that human suffering is an intrinsically bad thing? If we consider the atheist position, that the universe is a materialistic one, which means that there is only what we can experience with our 5 senses, then the question becomes hard to answer. The claim that there is too much suffering in the world presupposes that there is an objective standard by which you can measure whether something is good or evil. You're assuming that the sheer volume of suffering in the world is evil. What is this objective standard you are using to measure things? You're presupposing that it exists. If the atheist is honest, they'll have to admit that no such standard exists. So human suffering is neither good nor evil. If you're upset that so much evil exists, you're unintentionally offering evidence for the theistic position. Speaking about evil speaks of objective morality, and following from that, there must have been an objective moral lawgiver. What I see is that atheists borrow a Christian concept, the concept of objective morality, and then attempt to use it to argue against the Christian position. If humans are just evolved stardust on some obscure planet in some backwater galaxy, why does our suffering have any intrinsic moral component? Therefore, on what objective basis are you upset when you see people suffering? As an atheist, you don't have such an objective basis. Now, I've heard the argument made by non-believers that if you don't have a sense of right or wrong, you lack empathy. That if you need religion to give you objective morality, then you're probably an intrinsically deficient person. This argument misses the point entirely. It's not whether I as an individual need religion to keep me from doing bad things. It's whether the atheist worldview offers an objective foundation on which to base morality. I am convinced that it does not. What I think is useful is to bring this argument down to a practical, everyday life level, because to my mind that's exactly when this becomes most stark, most obvious. You can debate the argument in a theoretical way and try to pontificate endlessly, but real life examples are where I see solid evidence in favour of this argument. You win this argument by pointing to real life. I've written on my personal blog about objective morality and incentives. It's an important concept to consider. We live in a society where we're given incentives for being good to other people. If you want to stay out of prison, you have to follow the law. Although some laws are fairly trivial, and I do tend to complain about some of the dumb laws we have here in Australia, most of the laws we have are to prevent people from harming others, and are to keep society reasonably fair. We have incentives in place to keep people treating each other with a basic level of respect. We also have a culture that values being nice and kind to other people. If you want to have a circle of friends to support you, you need to show a basic level of respect to others. In this way, our Western society incentivizes us to treat others well. When we debate objective morality, we're doing so within that Western context. Now, if that context was taken away, if society fell apart and we had to fight for our survival, people's actions would be very different. In that circumstance, I think you'd see a very clear difference between people who hold to objective morality and those who consider morality subjective. In arguing with atheists on this issue, they seem comfortable with subjective morality. I intend to demonstrate with some examples the stark difference between objective and subjective morality. I want to show what atheism, and by extension, what subjective morality, opens the door to. I don't think that most atheists face up to this. I was watching a documentary the other night that talked about a community of gypsies in a European country. Gypsies are a people group that are universally hated in Europe. This documentary showed inside the gypsy community, and these people are living in desperate poverty. They had a reputation of being criminals, the kind of people who looked for opportunities to steal anything they could. Nobody will employ them, so they essentially scavenge their way through life. They showed children combing through garbage to find toys or useful items they could sell. These people truly have nothing. What happened in that community was that the gospel was preached and a lot of them became Christians. The local authorities reported that after this happened, crime rates went down. The gypsies who became Christians now had a desire to please God. The Bible gave them an objective morality, one aspect of which is, do not steal, and the community stole less than before. I'm not going to claim that everyone who became a Christian no longer steals, but there was a marked difference made on this community. This is an example of how the gospel transforms communities. Often missionaries will lift up the fact that there is general supernatural power in the gospel and its ability to change people's lives. I agree wholeheartedly, but I'd also like to point out that these people received an objective moral standard from the Bible. This impacted their behaviour as well. I assume most people watching this video have worked in a corporate environment. Have you noticed what corporate environments put in place with respect to things like fuel cards, company credit cards, and items of high value like laptops? Do you notice that companies assume that people are honest and require no accountability? Absolutely not. They make the assumption that anyone can be a thief and put policies in place to mitigate this. If you have a company credit card, you have to account for every dollar spent by getting a receipt. How well do you think subjective morality works in this kind of environment? Companies deal in reality, and they know anyone is prone to opportunism. Having worked in companies where people are given privileges that can be taken advantage of, most people seem to push the boundaries a bit. If they're given a company car to use for work, they might take the company car for a road trip on weekends. This is not what the boss intended for the company car, but they do it anyway because no one is keeping tabs on them. Companies know this. You can't expect people to be honest and trustworthy. You've got to mitigate this because people take advantage. At this point, I want to explain what I've noticed on that particular issue surrounding people. From observation, probably a quarter to a half of people will push boundaries and take advantage in small but significant ways. If they see an opportunity, they'll take advantage a little bit. I'm not suggesting that secular people are all prone to being bank robbers. It's usually people having a little bit of a scam on the side. This might not seem big, but when you're running a small company, those little things can add up, especially if your profit margin is narrow. So this is a way that we're seeing subjective morality play out in society. I've talked about small time taking advantage, but it's obvious that there is a small subset as well in society who are willing to do very bad things. When arguing about morality with atheists, I'm usually talking to someone who is a law-abiding citizen. Sometimes they're relatively virtuous individuals with a strong moral code. Given that they have a level of personal integrity, these atheists seem to take their own mindset and project it onto everyone else. They seem to forget this small subset of people who are willing to commit serious crimes. I won't spend a great deal of time talking about this subset of people. It's more interesting to talk about the vast majority of humanity who generally follow the law, but I will say I've met a number of ex-prisoners who have become Christians. They'll talk about the power of God changing them, and I don't doubt that that's true. One thing though is that Christianity gives them a reason to be good. Christianity gives them an objective morality that they need to follow. The Christian faith gives them both a what, objective morality, and a why, because they now want to please God. Let's talk about another example. I recently read an account by a man who lived through the Bosnian War. His town became a war zone and life centered around survival. Electricity was cut off, so you were simply trying to outlive the war and protect your family. The writer said something so interesting, and this speaks volumes about objective morality. He said that most men he encountered were neither good nor bad, they were just attempting to survive. They wouldn't hurt people for the sake of it, but because of circumstances, if they were faced with an opportunity to better their situation or help their family, they would take it. This included stealing or looting or even harming others in order to take something from them. If you went to certain parts of town at particular times, you were likely to either get beaten or even shot. You had to avoid areas and be indoors at certain times. Men would roam in bands, trying to find items that would help them and their families. As the writer said, these men weren't bad, they were just reacting to circumstances. This highlights my point. Most people are just acting on the incentives given in our society. Take those incentives away, and these people will act in a way that is immoral. There are historical examples where groups of Christians decided to love and serve people in spite of the cost to themselves. When they did this, they changed the culture around them. Sometimes the cost to these Christians was to face possible death. They stood firm on their objective morals based on the two greatest commandments, and in their extravagant service to others, it changed the world. The Christian faith gives the objective morality, and it also gives a good reason to follow that morality, which is to please and obey God. I wanted to mention that because I've talked to atheists about this kind of situation, and they often believe that the men in Bosnia I just talked about were morally justified. They assume that the drive to survive justifies acting immorally, that stealing, looting, mugging, etc. are okay if done out of desperation. The Christian church, though, has demonstrated love and service even in the most pressing situations, following an objective morality even in the face of extreme hardship and even death. I think this demonstrates that objective morality is superior to subjective morality. I haven't watched it myself, but one of my friends has talked to me about Derren Brown's documentary called Push to the Edge. He sets up a person to demonstrate that ordinary people can be driven to murder someone in the right circumstances. This is a very stark realization for all of us. We might think that we're good people, but in the right circumstance, or wrong circumstance if you want to say, we can do very bad things. This is why having an objective morality is so important, because we don't actually know how susceptible we are to doing bad things, and how we can justify them in the moment. I know this is a tired example that everyone uses, but the Nazis who killed Jews in concentration camps were often ordinary people who complied with orders. No doubt the people at the top of the Nazi hierarchy were psychopaths and moral monsters, but the average concentration camp guard saw himself as just simply doing his job. That's how terribly evil things can happen. Holding to an objective morality would be a much stronger deterrent from doing evil when under duress than a subjective morality. In the last few decades, the US and my country Australia has done more business with China. Our economies are now deeply tied with China. As a result of this, Western people have had significant dealings with Chinese people. I want to clarify something before I continue. What I'm about to say is not meant to be a criticism of the Chinese people. The Chinese people are often the greatest victims of their communist government. Please hear what I'm about to say from an angle of criticism of the Chinese communist government, not the people. There's a documentary, it's currently available on Netflix here in Australia, called The China Hustle. What happened was, American finance professionals worked out that there's a massive scam going on with Chinese companies listed on the US stock exchange. This reveals a deep difference between the US's financial system and the Chinese one. It shows that Chinese companies think it's fine to blatantly lie about their financial position on official reports. China doesn't see transparency in the same way as the Western world. This comes back to the notion of objective truth. The US highly values truthful reporting, China doesn't. I've also heard enough stories from friends who work for companies that deal with Chinese ones, and friends who have bought from Chinese merchants online, and the truth is, there's a great deal of lying and deception involved when dealing with Chinese businesses. One obvious reason for this is that China's official state religion is atheism. Our Western nations have been strongly influenced by Judeo-Christian values, including the value of truth. The objective morality of Christianity still holds strong influence over Western nations. What we see in China is a nation where objective morality has been deficient for long enough that it has major consequences on the running of that nation and the way its business people conduct commerce. Since COVID-19, there's been lots of talks about the lack of transparency in the Chinese system. Why would you expect a nation that has a lack of objective morality to be truthful? They see advantage in being deceptive. What are you going to appeal to get them to be more transparent? So far, being deceptive has worked for them. Where is the incentive for them to be more truthful in their dealings? This is what happens when objective morality is absent on a national level. Something I've had to grapple with lately is that leading up to and during World War II, there were Christians in Germany who supported the Nazis. There were Christians who opposed them, but many supported them. that's something that if we weigh up the Christian position with the atheist position, it does give weight to the atheist position. However, I would point to the fact that Britain fought the Nazis because they had a sense of duty to stop them. As a country still strongly impacted by Judeo-Christian values, they saw the Nazis embodied an objective evil that had to be stopped. I think we can all agree that it was a good idea that the Nazis were defeated. However, British people made massive sacrifices in order to do so. If that nation had not had an objective sense that what the Nazis were doing was evil, would they have made those sacrifices? You know what? I doubt it. Don't underestimate how much objective morality impacts on a person's willingness to sacrifice. Do you honestly think that if today's Western society was faced with an objective evil, that we'd be willing to oppose it like the British did? I truly doubt it, since we have an airy-fairy subjective morality now. One last example I'd like to talk about is something I discovered on a Reddit forum that blew me away. The topic was on cheating in relationships, and so many people said that around half of their friends had cheated on their spouse. Those are only the ones that were found out, by the way. There could have been more. It made me lose a bit of faith in humanity. Now, I recognise that a Reddit forum is not necessarily a good representative sample of the general population, but still, it was very eye-opening for me. I would never have expected that so many people cheat on their spouse. This is a great example of how objective morality is much better than subjective morality. If we look back 100 years ago, I'm certain people didn't cheat that often. People had a sense of duty to their spouse. Now, because we've opened the door wide open to subjective morality, people tend to think that if they want to pursue someone, they should do it, even if they're already married. People generally used to believe that you shouldn't cheat, that to cheat is objectively wrong. Nowadays, people justify their desire to chase after someone else. This is an example of how the increased secularization of society is causing damage because people are trading objective for subjective morality. Bringing this full circle, I'm demonstrating that the type of subjective morality that atheism eventually leads to results in bad consequences for society. The consequences are especially stark when people are under duress or desperation. Also, if the incentives to be moral are removed, people will be far less moral than they are in our current world when the incentives are bountiful. I think atheists would be horrified if they knew just how bad this could get as a result of the atheist worldview, and it's related to subjective morality. If subjective morality leads to such negative consequences, and if it is inferior to deal with the realities of life, that speaks volumes. The atheist might say, so what? Just because objective morality happens to be better for society and make nicer people, how does that provide evidence for God's existence? I would argue that if the Bible is true, what it teaches will ultimately lead to greater flourishing for people and society than atheism would. If it contains divine truth, it should have a positive impact on society. If we get away from that divine truth, we'd expect to see detrimental results, especially when taken to its logical or illogical endpoint. I would argue that's exactly what we see today. As I said at the very start, I don't see that atheism gives any kind of firm foundation for objective morality. Therefore, it ultimately leads to a subjective morality. People have a fairly universal sense of outrage when they see injustice, but that sense of injustice makes absolutely no sense unless there's some objective moral framework that's being transgressed. Otherwise, our outrage is mere opinion, and one opinion is as good as any other. No, a moral framework suggests a moral framework giver, a higher intelligence that set this framework in place. No other argument about morality makes coherent sense to me. For that reason, objective morality is one reason why I'm still a Christian. Thank you for watching, guys. Please subscribe, like, and continue on to the next video in the series. See you there!